In our industry of advancement services, there are a few rock stars. These are colleagues who we turn to for information and advice, and who help describe the right way, or the most accepted way, of recording our donors and gifts. One such font of knowledge is John Taylor. He is the creator of the Fund Services listserv. He has worked for advancement services shops, and he is now a consultant for many development operations. He is also the go-to guy for questions about IRS rules and for general best practices. In this episode, we are excited to bring to you Jianell's conversation with John Taylor. You are listening to All About Supporting Philanthropy, where we discuss advancement services and why it is so important to philanthropy.
When I first started with AASP, I kept hearing about this thing called fund services, and I hear that it's your baby. Can you tell me a little bit about what fund services is and how it came to be?
I'm happy to. Do we have 5 hours? It is. It's a long story. But it is my baby in a sense that I conceived it way back before the internet. And I wasn't the first person to develop a listserv, but it was a method of communicating across, at that time, the country, but we quickly exploded beyond that. To make a long story short, Duke University, which is where I was at the time, had developed a bunch of email exchange groups internally. And it was simply a way to group people together. So all of the faculty were on one list and all of the staff were on another. And I asked my friend, Charlie Register, who was the director of IT, if we could do something like that for people not within the Duke community. So Fund Services, and that's 8 letters, FUNDSBCS, was born. And we slowly spread the word, and the listserv was born. And this was, by the way, in 1994. And I left Duke to become a vice president at Case in 2002. Case agreed to host the listserv. And when I left Case and formed my own consulting practice for about a 4-year period of time, a key vendor, Ruffalo Cody, agreed to host the listserv. Back in the days, these were kind of expensive to run. And then NC State, when I went to work there, agreed to host it. And ultimately, in 2013, when I left NC State, it had become clear that Fund Services had become the listserv for the advancement services profession. And AASP was obviously the association for the advancement services profession. And so a few years later, I turned over ownership and hosting responsibilities for Fund Services to AASP.
How does this Fund Services listserv differ today when hosted by AASP than it originally did when you first started out of Duke?
Not by an awful lot, other than the fact that it has changed platform. Again, it was a major Domo platform for a while, then LSoft. This hefty award came from the company LSoft in 2013, 2014. It was the Melees Award, and it was bestowed upon Fund Services as being the best listserv in the world in that period of time. When we transferred ownership to AASP, we decided at that time that it didn't make sense for us to host the list. In other words, have our own servers and that type of thing. And so we agreed to have it hosted by LSoft. So that was another change. And then a few years ago, when AASP changed its platform to the now communities platform that you know and love on the AASP website, we shifted away from the LSoft platform to the communities platform that we're currently using. But quite honestly, other than that, the only big change has been growth. When I conceived of fund services back in 1994, we started with, I think there were 30 or 40 subscribers to the list that I had personally reached out to the point where when I turned it over to AASP, there were some 4,000 subscribers. The other thing that I love about fund services, as well as AASP's continued operation of fund services, is that we archive all of our messages. Those are now available in the archives at the AASP website. Every question, mostly, that could be asked has been asked and answered. So you can always, rather than worrying about, oh gosh, should I ask this question? It seems like it's been answered before. You can go in there and take a look at it. That's what keeps fund services going. And it's been a delight to moderate that.
What kinds of questions do people discuss or search for in the archives?
Quite often, well, again, the list is focused on advancement services topics. There's no rule that it has to be limited to advancement services topics. Prospect research is a subtopic that comes up from time to time. I would think that a lot of questions that do come up more often than not have to do with IRS rules and regulations. For no other reason, they keep changing. And just because they change doesn't mean that everybody is adhering to or have adopted those changes. And so they will ask on the listserv, how do you do this? How do you do that? Probably the most common questions that come up have to do with gifts from donor-advised funds. And can you use those to satisfy pledges? And what about benefits? And that sort of thing. A lot of people will ask for examples of job descriptions or organizational charts, or again, as I mentioned, prospect research activity. And how do you record? What's the definition of a contact, and what kind of reports do you? I mean, again, you name it. The question is asked. Age-old ones are, what do you have to save? What can you scan? What can you throw out? How long do you have to keep things? You name it. If it's an advancement services topic, it's been asked about on the listserv.
So how can some of our members who maybe haven't gotten involved with this listserv yet, how can they navigate to it? Where do they go?
The first step is to go to the AASP website, which is advserv.org. But if you go to the AASP website, advserv.org, and the very top banner, the dark blue banner, there is a link for AASP Connect. You click on that link, it'll take you to the community's website, and it's not just dedicated to fund services. It lists all of the different communities you can become a part of. But on the left-hand side of that page, there's a button for Register Today under the Connect heading. And then you can take it from there and it'll show you how to register.
Do you need to be an AASP member in order to be able to access fund services?
You do not. When we shifted to AASP, we did decide that we wanted to offer some functionality to members. And so for that, we have limited older archive emails to AASP members only. But when you click on that link, it says already an AASP member, former fund services member, log in here, or you can create an account. But no, you don't have to be a member of AASP to join the list. And that's one of the beauties of it.
That's awesome. Who do you think uses fund services? Is this limited, or, is this primarily newer people to the field that are using it, or do you get people of all experience levels?
Well, I'm not exactly new. there are a lot of us older folk who are on the listserv, which is great because we learn from each other, number one. We do help along people that are new to the list. But it's interesting. I'm glad you asked the question. It really is not just for advancement services anymore. Number one, it is not at all focused on higher education. Just as AASP is an association for the entire profession, regardless of what industry you are in, so is the listserv. But more to the point, I would be willing to guess that every single vendor that provides products and services to the advancement services community is a member of the listserv. They're also really interested in what's important to us right now so that they can further develop their products and services to address our needs. So it runs the gamut. And it's not just on the technical side either. I know of a great many vice presidents, vice chancellors, CFOs that are members of the listserv as well. They have just as much of a need to reach out as we do to each other. Who better to ask than 3,000 professionals that have lived and breathed this for many years?
What's the most complicated gift that you've ever had to work on?
Well, I think in general, the more complex gifts involve real estate. Now, that's not to say that they're always the most complicated. When I was at Duke University, we received a number of gifts of companies. I mean, we were part owners of a company. I'm not talking about just getting 100 shares of IBM, but instead being gifted an LLC. And again, a lot of real estate transactions can get kind of mucky, especially if they're not in your immediate area and you don't have the ability to really have boots on the ground to evaluate the property. I think this is all the more reason why organizations must have not only gift acceptance policies, but a gift acceptance committee. Because decisions on how, when, why, where, how, whatever to accept any kind of an in-kind donation can't rest with just the professional in the advancement services office. It needs to be a community decision. So in general, I think in-kind donations have created the most interesting, quite honestly, and I use this in a presentation that I do on, it's called A Donor Wants to Give You What? That is the name of the presentation. Well, many years ago when I was at Duke, a donor wanted to give us a statue of a camel. Okay. And it wasn't just a camel. It was a life-size camel, and it was a life-size man looking at the camel. It was just one big sculpture. And I think it took us 3 months as a committee to decide whether or not to accept it and why and how. And quite honestly, we ultimately decided it was definitely a gift because we had an art museum. We just hadn't dealt with anything like this before. But more to the point, the committee recognized that our gift acceptance policy, while it allowed for the acceptance of this, we didn't have a policy for displaying donated art outside. It's one thing to put a piece of art inside a museum, which you can choose to see or not see. It's quite another to put a statue of a life-size camel and man right across the street from the Student Union, which is where this piece of art actually ended up going. It took us 3 months to decide whether or not or how to accept that. But those are the more interesting and sometimes comical debates. I think nowadays the more curious donations are the ones that we don't know who the donor is. And a lot of this is causing organizations to take a look at their anonymity policies, whether or not they would accept a gift from an anonymous donor, or what is the degree of anonymity, that type of thing. But that's not the most complicated. The most complicated tend to be gifts of tangible assets, and what are you going to do with them? And a lot of this stems from back in the mid 80s and 90s. A lot of donors were giving left and right gifts of timeshares, swampland in Florida, and we were greedy. We'd accept anything that came our way, only to find out we couldn't liquidate it. And so that's why now a lot more minds better than mine need to take a look at these things. And can we sell it? Who can we sell it to? How does it work? That type of thing.
For all these different in-kind gifts, whether it's your, simpler goods and services, or property, real estate, stock, cryptocurrency, you mentioned earlier that this is all considered property. So do organizations typically turn these gifts around right away instead of hanging on to them?
It's a really, really good question. The answer is things have changed a lot from the olden days, the before times, as I refer to them. It was in the olden days when people would accept in-kind donations, property gifts, willy-nilly, and not give it a second thought. They might throw it into a closet. They might turn around and sell it. But thanks to the IRS, the times changed. And most notably in the mid 2000s with one of the Pension Protection Acts, where they implemented a new rule. And actually the rule went into effect even before then, and it pertained to vehicles. I call it planes, trains, and automobiles. It was vehicle donations, what the IRS was first concerned about, that donors were turning or donating to charity these broken down jalopies and claiming values that were not realistic. And they implemented, they issued a couple of new IRS publications, 4302 and 4303, a new form that you had to fill out for car donations, a 1098C, all designed to get people to stop trying to cheat the IRS by claiming too large a deduction. Then when the Pension Protection Act came out, they really drove home. It wasn't a new concept, but it was new for us on the charity side, that we had to tell donors whether or not their property donation was going to be used for related or unrelated purposes. And we could spend hours talking about that. But to your question, an unrelated gift is one that you can't do anything with. You have to turn it around immediately and sell it. A related gift is one where you can actually take the piece of equipment or the vehicle and use it. An interesting nuance to that is that if you are given something that you can't use, but you can sell it and take the money from that sale and put it to use, that is still an unrelated use gift. Fine. The point of all of this is that with the results of the IRS changes, a donor could only deduct their cost basis in an in-kind gift of property if it was for unrelated use only. You could no longer use the book value, the blue book value, or the fair market value. So the answer then is that we have to be much more mindful in the events and services profession so that we can receipt properly and that type of thing. Are we going to turn it around like in an auction? Are we going to keep it? Fine. what do we say on the receipt? Number one. Number two, if it's worth $5,000 or more, we have to check the proper boxes on the 8283, indicating whether or not it was for related or unrelated purposes. And if we do sell it within 3 years, we have to report that on an 8282, and at the same time indicate on that form, did we use it for related or unrelated purposes? Again, the IRS's interest here is trying to get donors to stop trying to claim too large of a deduction for these property donations.
So maybe an interesting tangent here. How would this concept tie into gifts from an anonymous donor? Are there additional implications, or maybe is it less complicated if you have an anonymous donor? Since how would you get a tax acknowledgement to an anonymous donor?
That's a good question. But even more to the point, what if the anonymous donor could care less about a tax deduction? One of the issues that we recently saw had to do with the admissions scandal, and some of the donations that were made related to that were anonymous. A lot of organizations are now saying we will not accept a gift from an anonymous source. We must know the identity of the individual. Now, there are going to be cases where the donor doesn't want anyone at the organization to know who they are, but they use a legal agent, and the legal agent knows who they are, and that legal agent can certify to us, that this person is a fine, upstanding individual, ethical standards. I mean, whatever. I mean, you have to have this written into your gift acceptance policy. But I think increasingly organizations are saying we're not going to accept a gift unless we know who the donor is. At least one person knows who the donor is, or we know a trusted individual who knows who the donor is. We just don't need someone to make an anonymous gift, and it turns out that they're not a very good person, but they go to the New York Times and say, well, I made a $10 million anonymous gift to so-and-so. I think we just have to be a little bit more cautious.
And how does this situation or scenario that we're discussing now differ from those who give anonymously, but those who want their gift to be anonymous to the public, but the fundraiser, say, knows who they are?
So, and again, we don't have enough time to really get into this in great detail, but there are, in my mind, 3 degrees of anonymity. And I work with organizations to develop anonymity policies that address these 3 degrees. And the first thing I should probably mention is that there's often some confusion between what a donor has requested and what a fundraiser has heard. Meaning, a donor will say, I want this gift to be anonymous. And the fundraiser will come to us and say, here's $1 million check, but the donor doesn't want anybody to know who it is. It's got to be completely anonymous. Well, is that really what the donor wanted? Well, 2 or 3 months later, you get a phone call or an email or a letter from the donor saying, did you get my check? I never got a thank you letter. It's not that they didn't want anyone to know. It's that they just didn't, to your point, they didn't want the public to know. So the 3 categories of anonymity for me are as follows, from highest to lowest. There's what I call deep throat anonymous, meaning that only one person at your organization knows who that is. We do know who they are, but we create an anonymous record on our database. We have smoke and mirrors to ensure that one person knows who that deep throat anonymous person is. So again, we know who they are, but nobody else does. Then there's the anonymous record. So that's on my record, it's flagged as anonymous, meaning you can see it. Anybody who has access to the database can see my record, but it's got a flag on it saying, John Taylor wishes to remain anonymous, meaning we don't share the information about who this donor is or anything of the sort outside of the university community or the nonprofit organization. When we generate internal reports, it shows up as anonymous, but the dollar amount and the gift fund and that type of thing. So that's the case where the donor doesn't want any public notification of their gift. And then there's the individual gift anonymous, where I have a regular record. I don't care who knows what I give to what, but every once in a while I may want to make a single gift. Maybe I want to surprise somebody. Maybe I don't want my wife to know that I'm making another gift to athletics. Maybe my wife doesn't want me to know that she's making another gift to women's studies. These are true. This happened at Duke University all the time. I don't want my wife to know I made a gift to the Iron Dukes. So the gift is flagged as anonymous, and the same treatment applies to it as if your record was anonymous. But when I write these policies, I write them indicating that the department that has the authority to assign each of these three levels rests with advancement services. I need to have the conversation with the donor to understand exactly what they want. I don't want the interpretation of the fundraiser, which may be accurate, but it may not be accurate. I want the donor to know that if I create an anonymous record for them, this means no one will ever know anything about any of your gift. And oh, by the way, that probably means you can't make a gift to your named scholarship fund. Because if you do, then people were going to see that a gift went to your named scholarship fund. And, so let's be careful here. So 3 degrees of anonymity, make sure the donor understands. And by the way, if, anything changes in the future and you want to become unanonymous, that's going to have an effect on all of your prior gifts. So just be aware of that.
So I can definitely see how having those gift acceptance standards and policies in place prior to receiving gifts can be incredibly important. So once you have that set in place, I just have to ask, though, if somebody really wants to be so incredibly anonymous and only one person at the organization knows who they are, what happens when that person leaves the organization?
Well, again, there's only one person that knows how to set up the record, but there is an electronic trail. Now, I won't get in. I can't even remember the gory details of how we did this. But in essence, Prospect Development had the authority to create the Deep Throat Anonymous record. So in advance, which was what we were using, they created an anonymous record, and that's what it said: anonymous friend, anonymous alumni, anonymous parent, we had different anonymous records, but whatever. But by creating that record, it automatically created an ID number for that particular record. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The prospect development person who created that record would jot down that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and they would store that number on the actual person's record in a hidden field. And so there were procedures. So only that one person had access to that particular hidden field using security log-on entries and that type of thing. So it's not that you had to rely on somebody's memory. The information was there, but only one person knew how to get or could get to it. If that person left, there obviously would be ways to dig in to get that information out.
Would the gift acceptance policies also have a threshold in place? We're not going to go through all this trouble for a $10 gift, right?
So that's what I recommend. And in fact, the gift acceptance policies typically use thresholds an awful lot. When I work with nonprofit organizations, higher education, whatever, I often see too many instances where the vice president has to approve a gift, or the gift acceptance committee has to approve a gift, or the board has to approve a gift. I don't like that. I think that the delegated authority should go to the fundraiser to accept a gift and not have to ask permission. But at a level, whatever is a meaningful level for the organization, you may want to defer. And so some organizations will say, a gift of 10 million or up has to be approved by the president or has to go to the development committee of the board or whatever. To your point, the creation of an it's easy for me to say, anonymous record, and go through all of those hoops and that type of thing, typically starts at the major gift level. So we'll only do this if it's a $25,000 or more gift. And in fact, I've worked with a number of organizations that still won't even do that for a $25,000 gift if they think it's just the one and only time they're going to get that gift. They'll put that gift on a generic anonymous record. But if they think that the individual is going to continue to make gifts over time, then they'll create a record and do all of that behind the scenes coding and that type of thing.
Is there any one thing that you wish everyone who ever worked in advancement services knew across the board, or just really understood solidly?
Well, this may sound flip, but I wish everybody knew that they knew it all. I mean, I think there's been for so many decades, I'm not even sure how to best describe it, a lack of senior leadership instilling in the advancement services professional that they've got this. And that's what I mean by I wish they knew that they knew it. They do. I just wish that there was a way that we could convey it better to senior leadership, that I do know the answer to these questions. You don't need to ask the other person down the street how they would do it. I know what the rules are. I mean, quite honestly, this is one of the reasons why, what is it now, 17 years ago, I thought, it might be a good idea to create a professional association for advancement services people. We are a profession. We are professionals. I just wish more senior leadership across the country would recognize and understand that, because we do know our jobs. We just sometimes don't feel, we're made to feel like we don't know our jobs. And that's the one thing I would say, is that you do know the answer. And if you need any of us to help stand up for you, we will. But you're pretty much always right.
So what kind of advice would you give advancement services leadership to help advocate for this kind of idea?
Well, I mean, I think advancement services leadership gets it. I think it's trying to sell it to their bosses, which is a bit of the challenge. And so my advice to all of us is that if we need help in convincing our leadership, then let's all do it together. That's what AASP is all about. It's not that there's safety in numbers, but there are numbers. And if you as an advancement services professional feel that you're running up to a brick wall and having a difficult time convincing your leadership that something is right, something is proper, and use fund services to go full circle to what we were talking about earlier. Use fund services to reach out to other individuals like yourself, maybe from similar kinds of organizations, to not create a gang, but to create a consortium of people that can sit down and have a conversation with senior leadership. I'm not the only one that does this. I know many of my friends do it as well, will have a conversation with a colleague. I can't get my boss to understand this. And I'll say, and they'll say, well, throw me into a Zoom meeting with them and we'll all talk this out. Sometimes it just helps to hear it said differently, but the same answer. So that's my advice: is don't think that you have to do this alone. We can do this together.
I recently had a conversation with someone who was doing all of the advancement services things in their own nonprofit, but had never heard of advancement services. So, of course, they're probably not going to find us from AASP, but say someone like that comes across this podcast, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who's maybe doing all the things, advancement services, but doesn't realize that our community is out there, that their work is a profession?
Well, hearing this podcast is going to be one really good thing. Not only is it a profession, but it's a profession that's now 30 years old. We can kind of timestamp the profession to 1991, and the establishment of the listserv in 1994, the establishment of AASP 17 or 18 years or so ago. Not everybody has heard. In fact, I was just talking. It's interesting that you say this. I was just talking to the new CEO of a foundation who was asking for my input and advice on how to professionalize his department. And I said, well, the first thing you probably should do is make sure that all of your fundraising staff have taken advantage of AFP and CASE resources. And he had never heard of AFP. Oh, okay, so there are people out there that are new to the profession that just haven't had a chance. The good news is that there are several thousand of us that are on the listserv. AASP does a lot of great professional development programming. So does CASE. I don't want to leave them out. CASE has published all three of the advancement services books. A fourth one is now underway. So my advice to somebody listening to this podcast and not realizing that there is a profession is learn 4 letters, AASP, go to the website, dig around. And by the way, now that I'm talking about AASP, the other thing, we talked about the listserv, and listservs are not for everybody. I get it. But the other thing that's so cool about AASP and one of the cornerstones of what we're all about are our best practices. As I mentioned earlier, there's not a question that hasn't been asked on fund services, but by golly, there are several hundred questions that have also been answered on the AASP best practices site. Now, you do need to be a member to access those, unlike being a member of fund services, but still, there's a lot of resources out there, and a lot of them are free. So, yeah, we're a profession, have been for 30 years. Hope I'm around for the next 30 to see it grow even more.
You have been listening to All About Supporting Philanthropy, a podcast from the Association of Advancement Services Professionals. A big thank you to our guest, John Taylor. Our interviewer is Jianell Present. Our coordinator is Amanda Garvin Adikoff. Theme music by Dwight Dozier, and the show is produced by Meg Padavani. You can find a list of our episodes at our website, advserv.org. For AASP, I am Jay Ballinger. Thank you for listening.